discovery of native children's bodies buried at so-called residential schools has inflamed outrage over the genocidal campaign of the Canadian government and Christian institutions, most notably the Roman Catholic and Anglican churches. Protests have broken out across Canada and several churches have been burned to the ground. This is not the first time that the Catholic Church has been implicated in diabolical atrocities. And for centuries, faithful Christians have grappled with the terrible evils done in the name of Christ. We are now going to consider one such historical case with the help of a Catholic philosopher of education, Sam Rocha. Thanks for coming on Forum, Sam.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I asked Sam if he would come on because I saw him discussing the animating ideas of Bartolomé de las Casas, the 16th century Spanish colonizer turned protector of the Indians. And I don't actually speak Spanish, so I'm going to just call him de las Casas from now on.
Sure.
And de las Casas witnessed the beginning of European colonialism. And over time, he became so repulsed by it that he was compelled to take action. He gave up the lands and slaves he had won in colonial conquest and dedicated himself to stemming the tide of horrors. Sam, how would you gloss his life?
I would say that Las Casas, his father, Pedro de las Casas, sailed with Columbus on his second voyage. So Las Casas is genealogically a part of the 1492 story of Spanish colonialism, the whole descubrimiento, discovery narrative, and then the conquista narrative, of course, as well, the conquest narrative. So Las Casas, as the son of a voyager with Columbus, was there as a late teen in the Caribbean, in the Indies, at the genesis of Spanish colonialism. That is how he was made a part of the encomienda system and given an estate and enslaved indigenous people.
And basically, that's the way that the Spanish colonialism proceeded, is that they would come in, conquer a territory, and then render the inhabitants of that territory slaves and force them to do the kind of labor of colonizing their own territory.
If they didn't resist or do anything that was offensive to the colonialists, otherwise, like the Taínos, they would just slaughter them. Now, in the cases of resistance, of course, they would often suffer casualties, and they would often use those casualties through a kind of martyrdom narrative to then attack. And so Las Casas witnessed in Cuba, modern day Cuba, one such destruction of indigenous peoples. And he also, of course, witnessed the development of the encomienda system and chattel slavery that was enslavement of indigenous people. We often think of slavery through the transatlantic slave trade and African enslavement through the Middle Passage and whatnot. And that was going on mainly through Portugal. At the time, within the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal had been given a kind of papal rite of passage into the Canary Islands and Africa, whereas Spain was much more, from 1492 forward, had much more access to the Atlantic and to the New World, or the Nuevo Mundo.
And the Pope had essentially just drawn a line, vertically down a map and said, to this side Spain and to this side Portugal.
Exactly right. Now, there was a lot of disputes, including canonical disputes, because all of the bulls that proclaimed these things were ecclesiastical decrees from the Pope, and they were often disputed through canonical arguments. And so, in certain cases, the favoring of the Kingdom of Portugal was opposed by the very new, actually, Kingdom of Spain. We have to recall that Spain itself is a very controversial entity as a nation or as a kingdom.
And before we get too deep into the historical detail, we should probably take a step back and really meditate on the role of the Pope in this, because if I'm recalling correct, and I don't have it directly in front of me, so feel free to correct me, but
Sure.
Was it not Alexander VI himself who made the line of demarcation.
Yes,
The
and
most
there were,
infamous and terrible of all the Borgia popes, the most probably the most corrupt pope that ever lived.
well, exactly, and it's also within the narrative of the Holy Roman Empire. So it's sort of like the the end of the rise of this idea that, at least in the West, that the Latin Church would become the new Rome.
Mm,
So very far from City of God, where Augustine is essentially apologizing to Romans for the
mm,
ascent of Christianity and trying to guarantee to them that it wasn't a Christian ideal. Now we see a very different political emergence of the church at this time. And it's important to note that, though, because whenever Las Casas turned against the against Columbus and Cortés, and against the crown, and against ultimately the authorization from Rome, he was turning against an entire colonial Catholic set of assumptions that truly made him. I mean, he was seen as a lunatic. He was seen as a
mm,
fool. He was often critiqued as being mad and insane. Um,
mm.
but one thing I think that's important is that Las Casas gets a lot of credit, and I just think he deserves a lot of credit because he renounces his rights as a peninsular, as someone who's Spanish born, as someone who is within the high castes of the colonial universe at that time. He renounces so much. Very famously, he advocates for African enslavement early on in his
Mm.
first writings, until he sees what the Portuguese are doing, and then he turns against that as well. He enters a Dominican order, and he spends 10 years in study before he emerges from there, writes his Apologia, goes back to Spain, has the Valladolid debate with Sepulveda, where him and Sepulveda air essentially a decade's worth of arguments they've been having in Latin through writing in public there. But what I think is important is that one of the biggest reasons we know from Las Casas for why he made those turns, most of it was just first person encounters with oppression. Just watching the violence of Spanish
Committing it
colonialism,
himself.
committing it himself. Oftentimes, the worst violences he observes. He doesn't, of course, interfere or do anything.
Sure.
But it's not clear to me that he, for instance, took up arms against the Taínos ever. But he was definitely present and saw it. But the Dominican order had actually been in the New World kind of from the get go as well. And they were Dominican preachers who were as, if not more, radical than Las Casas,
I mean, that was
who
kind of what I
were,
had read in the background for this episode was that Las
yeah,
Casas is there. He's a colonizer. He's,
yeah,
doing the Spanish nobility thing of getting rich and, persecuting the people that he considers to be the most numerous and innocent and good-hearted people on earth, and subjecting them to, terrible slavery and all kinds of horrors. And then some
yeah,
Dominican preachers show up and say, what the hell are you doing? This is completely contrary to the gospel. And
absolutely.
Las Casas and others eject them from their territory.
Yep.
And then it's after that. So this weird history where he shows up, he's young, whatever, we all, he's young, he's doing things that are crazy. People come and tell him this is crazy.
Yeah.
He refuses them, and then after that refusal has some kind of awakening. What does that look like?
I mean, it's you have to remember what he was doing um, was morally crazy,
Yeah.
and it was also the status quo of Spanish nobility. He was doing something morally crazy, but from the point of view of his station, he was simply, acting like a Spaniard in the New World. So when they went into Cuba, for instance, he was just there. But he became his conscience was assaulted by the moral atrocities that he was a part of and that were being committed. And whenever he heard the first word from the pulpit against those atrocities, his reaction was to deny and reject and hide.
Mm.
But the voice of conscience was not denied, and soon thereafter he began to reform. And of course, I think the height of his reform is when he enters the Dominican order,
Mm-hmm.
and he essentially joins. But this is, I think, a really powerful testament to the power of the scholastic Dominican Thomistic tradition, that they had a kind of moral clarity about the atrocities of colonialism. I mean, from the very moment that it set foot upon the Americas,
Mm-hmm.
and they were speaking out boldly against them. I mean, one of the practices of the Dominicans, just to show you how radical they were, is that on a deathbed confession, if someone who was a part of the encomienda system and had enslaved people under their title, if they didn't agree in their confession to free their slaves, the Dominicans would not give them absolution.
Mm.
They would damn them to hell
Mm.
for it. Which is, I think, from a theological Catholic point of view, there's arguably nothing more radical.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, there in this sense we can see that the Catholic Church at this time is both incredibly corrupt, but also there's something vital of, Saint Ambrose confronting the Roman Emperor and telling him to repent that still
Yes.
persists, and
Well,
that's part of.
definitely. And I think that it's a part of that reform identity of the mendicant orders themselves, in
Mhm.
particular the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Right? They certainly aren't perfect historically, but they do have this charism, not only as an order of preachers in the case of the Dominicans, but also as a reform order. And I think that I think we should see them in that light, in this relationship they have to colonialism. What I'm trying to say here is that Las Casas deserves, I think, an important place within this story. But I think that we can even include within this the entire Dominican order, and maybe perhaps the mendicant orders in general. And what that creates is then certain points of tension between Dominicans and Franciscans who did not follow that charism of their order and
I was
instead
about to
belonged.
ask about that because
Yeah.
one would assume that all monastics who have a sort of hatred for the world and have died to it and have been raised in Christ and taken a vow of poverty and all these things, that they
Right.
would all share this kind of disgust at the sort of crass accumulation of wealth.
No, they didn't. But again, this is a part of the story, at least like within the Franciscan order. A great deal of the arguments were around the rule and how literally and how radically they ought to embrace it with respect to property
You're
and
speaking the
poverty.
rule of Saint Francis
I'm
himself.
I'm talking here in terms of the rule of Francis, and the
Yeah.
fact that the Franciscan order almost fell before Father Francis passed because of this
Mm.
very controversy. So the love of riches and power and whatnot is not foreign to the mendicant orders, and yet still we do see that charism lived out within those orders. And I think this is the complexity and the kind of layered approach that's needed to understand not only the history, but also what abolitionism and a decolonial or anti-colonial Catholic politics would look like today as well.
Because we're basically looking at the same situation today. I'm standing
Yes.
outside the Catholic Church, and it's not my place to, damn anybody or condemn the Catholic Church by any means. And I greatly appreciate my Catholic brothers and sisters. But when you look at the responses to what's been going on in Canada, and frankly, the same story could be told in the United States. These residential quote unquote schools are not a uniquely Canadian phenomenon.
Not
We
at
we see a
all.
miserable response, and I at this point I don't know. Well, you should respond. I don't want to say too much because it's not my church, but it just seems to me totally absurd.
Well, look, I think everyone has a moral right to say something within this society, if we want to think of our society in any sense as moral, as eligible to be understood in some sense as a moral society, as a free society, as a liberal society. Um, the Canadian story is unique because of the unique relationship between the crown and the government, and within the Commonwealth understanding, and the unique situation of the church within the British understanding of the crown and government. Really, the British system is basically subdivided between kind of the practical government, the royal crown, and then of course the Anglo-Catholic Church. And within Canada, because of its split francophone and anglophone identity, which is of course a colonial construct,
Yes.
you have a bilingual nation, but also a bi-ecclesial nation, in the sense that the Church of Canada is royally entrusted to Anglo-Catholicism, but practically within the colonial execution of the spread of Canadian society within this continent, we see a major role played by the Roman Catholic Church, which you wouldn't normally see Roman Catholics and Anglo Catholics a part of the same story, but that's the case in Canada. And so I think about 60%, and by the way, a lot of this was through education. So the treaties that were signed all the way from the east all the way to about the prairies in the Midwest, a lot of those treaties entailed access to educational resources and educational institutions. And in many cases, the role of education was entrusted by the government on behalf of the crown to the churches, and from the churches to the diocese and to the orders. And so the residential schooling system that emerged from that arrangement um, was almost completely carried out by the church on behalf of the government, on behalf of the crown, and its unique relationship to the state.
Yes.
That's something that makes Canada kind of stand apart from the rest of the Americas, is this very odd, because Canada doesn't have a revolution, right?
Right.
So the Canadian state, unlike Mexico and South America, where you obviously had a crown state relationship, but because of revolutions, those ties were broken, and so you have a different complexity. And the case of the U.S., it's also a revolutionary state, and that it threw off the crown.
Yeah.
But what's interesting in the U.S. is that you have different approaches to the colonial treatment of its indigenous peoples, largely because so much of the present day landmass of the United States actually belonged to Mexico and Spain. And so, for instance, the treatment of Ute and Navajo and Puebla and Apache, and in some cases Comanche, that part of the story is very different than Iroquois and the Lakota, Dakota, Sioux, and so that story gets split. And I think in the U.S., the church hides pretty well from the duties it owes the indigenous peoples, whereas in Canada, when you find over 200 grave sites of children that have never been reported and are hidden, and it's in the Diocese of Kamloops in a school run by the Oblates until 1996. Well, there's nowhere to hide there, right? But to your point, the optics of the situation are different because of, I think, very concrete reasons, historical, political reasons. But I do think that the story of indigenous enslavement, indigenous deculturalization, the stealing and the appropriation and the dispossession of land, and of course ultimately of culture and of life, the mass loss of life across the Americas of indigenous people as a result of colonialism. That story is a story that, from the very tips of the Yukon Territory all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, Roman Catholics have a part and a role to play in that whole story.
Can we
And that,
pause right there with the Yukon Territory, though?
yeah.
Because I think there's also this theological question that maybe we can, come back to later or address now, which is why did they feel theologically compelled to commit this kind of genocide? When you look at the Russian American company and
Mhm.
the Tsarina sending missionaries to the Aleut, there was a lot of abuse, there was a lot of crime, but there was not the same approach where we were going to destroy your language, we're going to completely obliterate your culture. There was ethnic cleansing, there was moving people around, there was slavery, but the relationship with the church and the state was, it seems, at least to me, based on the limited reading I've done, more complicated and variegated than what we're seeing in the Canadian example. And I don't really understand why the Oblates would feel it necessary theologically to destroy the culture of these people, because that's really what it is. Like, why would you abuse a child for speaking his native tongue?
Right.
That's not, I mean, theologically speaking, I'm not just trying to sit here as, a 21st century American and pretend
No,
like I'm
no.
morally superior. I'm saying that, there were, 18th century Russians who didn't feel the need to do this. Why,
Yes. Yes.
I don't understand. So maybe can you explain that theological angle?
Well, I think what you're doing here is exactly right, and it's really important to not give any oxygen to the idea that, oh, these were people of their time and we have to, it's presentist or whatever. One of the reasons why Las Casas specifically is such a important touchstone is because he is an immediate counterfactual to the idea that there was
Mm.
no outspoken opposition to the Spanish encomienda system, to indigenous conquest, to enslavement. He's one of many examples. And one point I always like to make is that we shouldn't for a second think theologically that the person who is oppressed, that the person who is dispossessed of their language, of their culture, of their land, of their life, of their families, we shouldn't think that their moral conscience, knowing that they are being oppressed, doesn't account as a protest to
Mm.
that. And so for me, that line that we see is good to ignore and to not give any oxygen. And I think your approach, your theological approach, is appropriate. And if we go all the way back to Gregory of Nyssa, we can see that there have been there has been a theological line. Paul, for instance, I want to argue that even amongst the Greeks, there are sophisticated ways in which we can see uh, protests to forced servitude and other forms of injustice like that. Now, the Greeks are strange because a lot of the Christians, for instance, Sepulveda, who argued for the morality of slavery, for the morality of this, they often went to Aristotle.
Yes.
But a lot of the Christians who argued against it also went to Aristotle.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting is in the theological debates, there's an ongoing philosophical debate about the dignity of the human person, about the moral status of human people within a political environment. And we don't see really like two schools of thought emerging. We actually see the same school of thought producing two morally completely contrasting kinds of arguments. And
Mm.
so whenever you carry that over to your question of like, why did people do this? Look, the Jesuits, I mean, Georgetown was built by slaves. Enslaved people built Georgetown's
Yeah.
buildings, several of them. So there was a lack of um, moral conscience by numerous Roman Catholics and Roman Catholic orders. And there were even those who saw their war against the indigenous or their oppression of indigenous people as theologically um, explainable. I mean, Our Lady of Guadalupe, who appears around the same period of time in the 16th
Mm.
century to Juan Diego, who is born before Columbus arrives. So Juan Diego is a pre Columbian Aztec man. He's well into middle age whenever Our Lady
Yeah.
of Guadalupe appears to him. She appears to him speaking Nahuatl, the indigenous language of the Aztecs. She appears to him as an indigenous Aztec indigena woman. She gives him a tilma, a mantle with a codex, a cosmological codex that
Mm.
would have been familiar to the Mayan and Aztec astrological imagination. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that the scandal of that apparition and the witness, the divine, because you don't get more theological than Mary showing up.
No, of course. And what
Right?
she's doing is so profound. She's doing enculturation. She's bringing the
Exactly.
gospel to him in his language. I mean, this is like Cyril and
Exactly.
Methodius showing
Yes.
up and bringing an alphabet, bringing learning, exchanging as human to human being, which I
This is
think,
what Paul did at the end of
yeah,
Acts when he says to the Greeks, he says, "Look, I'm not here bringing you some, Jewish or Hebrew thing. I'm not here bringing you some Roman or Stoic thing. You have an altar on your land to an unknown God. That altar, he speaks to them as a Greek. This is why Paul, of course, is a genius because he's
yeah.
all things to all people, right?
Mhm.
Um,
He's
and
going
I
into
think
the riches of Greek pagan hymnography and poetry and bringing the gospel
absolutely.
through that.
Absolutely, just like the Neoplatonism of John was the gospel that spoke to the Oriental churches and that
Mhm.
raised the largest demographic of Christianity
Mhm.
in the world at that time. What Latins, we were in the minority throughout all of the time of the early church. The Alexandrian and Oriental churches were far larger than us by by people. Um, and so, what Our Lady of Guadalupe and Juan Diego did very naturally, Las Casas did with without having some of the predispositions of being able to understand that early, but he did it in a reactionary and I think morally upstanding way, especially for those of us who, I'm a mestizo. So
Mhm.
I have Juan Diego in one arm and Las Casas on the other.
Yeah.
I don't get to have a clean side, a clean ancestral relation to this, but I do have some ability, I think, to see in Las Casas that turning of conscience as a part of my identity that's needed. That's the side of conversion.
Sure.
And to also see, of course, in the Virgen Morena, we call her in Spanish, the brown virgin, the dark
Mhm.
virgin, um, in that, apparition of Mary as a woman of the Mesoamerican, pre-Columbian native place, to also see in that enculturation message that God is present in all of His creation, and there's nowhere where we can't find God.
And there is something really interesting to go back to Las Casas for just a moment, which is
Yeah,
his repentance is not merely a question of intellectual assent. Like he
right.
called for African slavery and then he stopped calling for it.
Yeah,
It's also not merely a question of, the affairs of his house in terms of selling his slaves and selling his property, but it's
that's right.
also a change of his form of life. And this is kind
That's
of
right.
getting back to the difference between the mendicants, which maybe you can speak to, which
Hmm.
is, to my understanding, Las Casas tried to do many things. And to some degree, we can say that his projects failed or met with success to differing, degrees.
Sure.
One of the things, as I understand, that he attempted to do was to find a way for, now that the circle has been broken, now that that hell has broken out on the island of Hispaniola or
Yep.
on Cuba or whatever, that now that
Yep.
where it's like in the famous that film The New World, after this moment of encounter there's no real going back. So
Yep.
there's been this moment of encounter where all these evils and atrocities have been committed. How are we actually going to live? Like, what are we going to do? What's is there a way out of from this evil? Which I think is a question that confronts each one of us today, and that's why I'm asking it. And when you look
Yeah.
at the form of life of, for example, a Russian monk coming from Siberia versus
Sure.
an oblate coming from Quebec or wherever they're coming from, they have different forms of life.
That's
And it
true.
seems to me that what you're saying is that there's also different forms of life, or at least a different worldview between a Franciscan and a Dominican. And to go back to the Pope himself, I mean, I don't want
Hmm.
to disparage the popes, but my understanding is that in the later part of Las Casas' life, it's Julius II is Pope, correct?
Right.
Literally the imperial Pope riding on horseback,
Yep.
engaging in battle directly.
Yep.
So this is the time of Reconquista, of
Yep.
expelling. Can you just talk about the worldview and the form of life clash here a little bit?
I think there's two ways to think of it.
And I'll say
One,
one more thing. I'll be a little
yes,
spicy here. I
no,
think there's a
please.
different spirituality. There's a different relationship to God.
Yeah, yeah,
Is
I'm into
that is that
this.
heretical to say as a Catholic?
Absolutely not. Our relationship to God, and I mean, the charisms are not always value added, right?
Mm-hmm.
The personal or within religious life. I think we have to understand uh, charisms. They're gifts of the Holy Spirit, but because of the privative nature of evil, every good gift from God, just like Lucifer being the great light, the angel of light, a great gift from God, is eligible. There's that saying in Latin, the uh, corruptio optimi pessima est, right? The corruption of the
Mm-hmm.
worst, the corruption of the best, right, is the worst.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes I think what we see in the story of the church, perhaps this is the story, certainly of the Latin Rite, is that the very best uh, of the church is often that which is most eligible and that which is most perniciously manifest as the great evils of the church. One place I would go, and this may seem idiosyncratic historically, is to Augustine at the end of his life in Hippo in North Africa, as
Mm.
the Vandals from Europe are pouring down and bringing ruin to the Alexandrian church. Um, the burning of the Alexandrian library is probably the pyre of that time, but Augustine was a worldly man. He was by no means naive. He had a child and a concubine, and he was
Yeah.
born of a uh, capable Roman father and professor of rhetoric. There was no reason for Augustine, the bishop, to not be aware of all the implications, political, social, and otherwise, and of course theological and ecclesial, as the bishop of Hippo as this was happening. But you'll notice that he doesn't say a whole lot about any of that.
Mm.
He writes his retractions, he writes his confessions, he finishes his work, so to speak, his commentary on the Psalms, his homilies. He preserves it, and in many ways, you could say it's a miracle that Augustine survives the Vandals. And that, by Augustine in this case, I mean his work, right?
Yeah.
We lost a lot in that exchange. And I think that, it's only a few centuries after that where the displacement of Christianity by the Vandals is actually filled primarily within the Arab world by Islam. And that remakes even modern day Algeria, which has Algeria is the modern day place where Augustine,
Yes.
Thasgase, and Hippo would have been. But it, of course, now is much more representative of its Islamic and Arabic heritage. And of course, there is an Arab Christian church. But what I'm trying to say here is that Augustine didn't promote a reconquista or a resistance to Vandal conquest or any of those things. In many ways, Augustine's City of God was what he left us in terms of political theology. And it's precisely that work that Augustine left us that Las Casas makes equal use of to Aquinas in his defenses of the moral and natural rights of indigenous people in the Americas. And I think that usage is historically very telling in terms of the way that the worldview of the Reconquista and of the peninsular Iberian violence against Jewish and Muslim and Moorish peoples, the idea. I mean, it's one of the birthplaces of the modern idea of blood and soil.
Mm.
The idea of pureza de sangre, purity of blood,
Mm-hmm.
and the emergence of these
It's also the
previously.
creation of the Spanish nation. I mean,
Oh, totally.
there's
Oh,
no
totally.
nationalism.
Yes.
That.
Now, by the way, there's another side to this, and I just have to say this as someone who maybe this is my mestizaje speaking. There's also, though, the black myth of the Spanish in the anti-Hispanic propaganda of the Dutch and the English, who, of course, were in competition with Spain, who often used Las Casas' own writings against the Spanish to argue for Hispanic inferiority and for Iberian inferiority, ironically, to simply perpetuate the same kind of violence against the same
what we're
peoples.
talking about, and we should be very clear, is there are passages of Las Casas. I might edit in some of Viggo Mortensen reading this for Howard Zinn or whatever, but there are some passages which are truly bone chilling. And I mean, we're trying to have a casual discussion that does not lead our listeners to weep. But I mean, there have been. I'm not going to pretend like I've been extremely disturbed by things I've read from the American conservative and others.
So easy to subject that our Spaniards have no more consideration for them than beasts. No, for thanks be to God, they have treated beasts with some respect, I should say, instead like excrement on the public squares. The Indians began to seek ways to throw the Christians out of their lands. They took up arms, but their weapons were very weak and of little service in offense and still less in defense. The Christians, with their horses and swords and pikes, began to carry out massacres and strange cruelties against them. They attacked the towns and spared neither the children, nor the aged, nor pregnant women, nor women in childbed, not only stabbing them and dismembering them, but cutting them to pieces as if dealing with sheep in the slaughterhouse. They made some low, wide gallows on which they hanged victims' feet almost touched the ground, stringing up their victims in lots of 13 in memory of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles, then set burning wood at their feet and thus burned them alive. When tied to the stake, the cacique, or chieftain, Hatway, a very important noble, was told by a Franciscan friar about the God of the Christians and of the articles of faith, and he was told what he could do in the brief time that remained to him in order to be saved and to go to heaven. The chieftain, who had never heard any of this before, and was told he would go to hell, where if he did not adopt the Christian faith, he would suffer eternal torment, asked the Franciscan friar if Christians all went to heaven. When told that they did, he said he would prefer to go to hell.
It's utterly despicable, and what Las Casas recounts is all kinds of tortures and maiming and just a true hell on earth. I mean, something from Dante's Inferno brought to life. So one could easily imagine, a churlish Englishman deploying that text as a justification for his own sort of bizarre racialist imaginary.
Yes, and this is, to me, this is why that layered, nested complexity is needed. If anything, to understand the fact that the moment, for instance, that where Peter is recently published a critique of a particular statue on the what's that walk? The Camino. What is it called? The
Way of Santiago.
Yeah. There's a very imperial, white, light skin presenting statue there, and there was a critique of that, and there was immediately a response from Spaniards in Spanish saying this is Anglophile, anti-Hispanic propaganda, and I'll be honest, that's how nested this stuff gets. One thing I pointed out in the past, just to show how this gets onto the shores of the United States of America, the 1619 Project, which dates the first bringing of enslaved people to the shores of Virginia in 1619, that gave birth to the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery within the United States, the Confederacy, the South. I mean, people know this story. Which of course gave birth to Jim Crow, which gave birth to the Civil Rights Movement, which gave birth to arguably everything all the way up to Black Lives Matter today. That ship was commandeered by British pirates waving a Dutch flag to trick people, who commandeered a Portuguese ship that was named after John the Baptist that was on its way from Iberia to Veracruz in Mexico, True Cross, from which they took they plundered any number of things, including, in the diary it says 25 or odd enslaved Africans, and brought them from that route from Iberia, from Portugal, João Bautista, to Veracruz into the United States via Virginia. And that just shows you how, there we have Dutch, British, pre-Mexican, Spanish, Portuguese, African. It's all layered there within the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. And I think that one thing that Bartolomé de las Casas does, which is I actually disagree with a lot of commentators and scholars about this. So a lot of scholarship today is very critical of the Valladolid debate for being too academic and too theoretical.
And we should basically explain that this is the kind of Renaissance humanist style of debate that one might associate with Luther and Erasmus, or other such cases, between Servetus and Calvin. Yes. Well, I guess that wasn't really debate; that was more of a assassination. But you get the drift.
Yeah. Well, Valladolid is unique not because of it being a disputation. Obviously, disputatio is one of the scholastic charisms, we could say, coming out of the scholastic method in the Middle Ages. And we would have seen these disputatios even within interreligious debate, especially through the pen. I mean, the Islamic Golden Age, which preceded, in many ways, the Middle Ages, and kind of preserved Aristotle for Christianity in many cases, was there were scholars in places like Toledo, for instance, Spain, where it was easy to find a rabbi, an imam, and a priest, and any number of secular scholars, all there debating. What was interesting about Valladolid is this is the first debate post 1492 on 1492.
I see. So this is the first discussion of the event in question.
That's right. And it's a unique event because, in some sense, all of these scholastic work of the centuries that preceded the 16th century on questions of human dignity and the nature of the human person, and on the soul, and all these things that take us all the way to Aristotle's De Anima and Plato's, theory of Plato's soul, essentially, that Christianity inherited and repurposed, the immortal soul, that whole idea. It really becomes concrete in a way that it hadn't quite become, even within the difficult and many cases bloody disputes, not only between Jews, Catholics, and Muslims, but between Christians. The Catholics, we went to war with each other a great deal, especially along the East-West divide and other such things. Constantinople was not just a merchant's paradise. It was also a place where a great deal of violence was doled out between. It was inter-Christian, intramural violence. But Valladolid was a place where the questions of the justification of violence against people was raised probably for the first time since the old Gentile Jew arguments of the Council of Jerusalem, you might say. That's a kind of radical claim, but I think I could defend that claim.
We're basically talking about the Europeans, or specifically the Western Europeans, specifically the Spanish, coming from a position of relative, historical, being a backwater essentially, to all of the sudden now a huge imperial power. I mean, rising to power very dramatically.
Yes.
And now they find themselves like a man like Las Casas. He's 18 years old or whatever. He's committing genocide. And now he's looking at his hands and saying, what have I done? And he's coming back to Spain, and he's trying, as an aristocrat, he's trying to discuss with the king and with others. And he doesn't go overnight from, committing genocide to, I've now got, Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn on my, like he's not going to it's a progressive evolution in his mind of concepts and ideas and his approach. And all he can really do, I mean, the war economy, the imperial subjugation and rapine of the New World is ongoing. People are getting fabulously rich. So one man, what is he really to do about it? He joins the Dominicans. He tries to kind of get this whatever arguments he can make. But as a single man, what is he supposed to do? Ride on horseback and just cull everyone down? He goes back to Spain. He tries to reason with people, assuming, I think, and maybe now I'm just impugning too much into his mental state, but
Sure.
assuming that the king is a good man, and if I talk to him and present to him the horror, like he doesn't know, he's never been to Hispaniola.
Yeah.
If I tell
Yeah.
him what's going on, maybe something will be done.
Yeah.
And
And
I feel
that's the
like this
contents
debate,
of his letter, the brevissima, the very short account of the destruction of the Indies. That's exactly what he's doing in that letter. He's young at this time, so he's naive. He says, if I can just tell him descriptively in a short letter exactly what I just saw, it'll move his heart, and he'll put an end to all of this, right?
yes.
Yeah.
And so that obviously doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
And so
work.
now we're getting to the stage like we've just been discussing of this debate. And then
we get to the debate, but just before the debate, though, he does try out. There are two stages before it, and one of them, which gets us back to that earliest question or the earlier question you asked, in that his first option is something of a let's just leave this place and go to a new place, and so he goes to modern day Venezuela, the Cumana, and he tries to found sort of like a different colonial state.
he tries to make some reform of colonialism.
Yes, and by the way, one of the things that I think is controversial with Las Casas is that he remained committed to the evangelization of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. He believed it totally throughout all of his life that he wanted to bring the message of Christ to all people in the world. He never saw that as not being his mission.
Sure.
He just argued that the message of Christ was not compatible with coercion, and that wherever the message of Christ came in violence or coercion, in fact, that message was corrupted and was demonic and was, the message of Satan, not of Christ. But his project in Cumana failed. There's no other way to put it, and it failed because he had no support from the crown, much less from politicians. And it failed also, I think, because his account of what this alternative approach to colonialism was never really got around to being developed because he was so focused and so much of his work of attacking and critiquing the present day colonialism. But it's after that. Oh, by the way, another thing he sees when he goes to South America is he goes into the territory of the Portuguese. And he sees the horror and the terror of Portuguese enslavement. I mean, Americans often don't know this, but 78% of all transatlantic slave trade of all enslaved people brought from Africa were brought to Brazil, the shores of Brazil. And Brazil was the last nation on these continents to abolish slavery, and the rise of the Afro-Latin, the legacy of Iberian slavery in Latin America, is something that I think we still fail to appreciate and fail to understand, and it operates in Latin American society, I would say, to this very day. The problem of the Brazilian favela is not just a problem of class. It's deeply embedded in the history of enslavement in Brazil. And there's
part of this whole debate about, critical race theory and all these things is the fact that colonialism as a category is kind of flat in public discourse. Like there's actually multiple different forms of colonialism.
That's right.
And if I can just radically simplify for listeners who've not, gone and done all the reading or whatever, there's basically three ways that you can colonize the New World. You can come in and just commit total genocide and ethnic cleansing, and then replace the indigenous population with Europeans, which is like mostly what happened in America. You can, or like United States. I mean, you can enslave the native populations, which is what we've been talking about, or you can destroy the native populations and bring in African slaves or slaves, from China or whatever else, some other place, some third group, right? And there's these three different methods that have, obviously they're interlinked as we've been talking about, but they result in wildly different outcomes.
They do. And this is why whenever we say things like settler colonialism, that refers to the first description, so settlement. So settlement, of course, requires clearing.
You got to find some like English dissenters who want to pretend that they didn't lose the Civil War and install them somewhere. You need those Puritans.
Sure. Yeah, that's another part of. Whenever you get into the weeds on the Portuguese enslavement system, the people leaving Portugal to go give it a shot in modern day Brazil, they were not the wealth or the high classes of amongst the Portuguese. They went there in some sense as feeling like they were the oppressed of Portugal, and so their ability to oppress, but they couldn't even afford in many cases the enslaved people brought to the shores, so they would get loans from the crown that they would get for enslavement, and so the crown then had this double bind on them of them owing credit, and so there was actually a kind of they were slave holders and owners, but they themselves were owned and held through credit to the crown, and that created a really nasty system.
And it's also maybe why Las Casas did not emerge in the Portuguese context. He could emerge in the Spanish context because it was the Spanish nobility coming to the New World and conquering it.
Yes, in many cases that was true. Now, there were, of course, crypto Jews, who saw the emergence of the New World as a great opportunity to escape the oppression that they, in many cases, for several generations had undergone. And so you'll notice, for instance, in the north of Mexico, there are no pork dishes, goat, and beef, and that's a sign of the crypto judío movement into the norteños, and that's the part of Mexico and the United States that I'm from. So there's a very different style. So when you look at the flat tortilla, and if you compare that to a pita or naan or whatever, you start to see a kind of even culinary sensibility across those things. And so, this really matters, though. And I think your point about colonialism being different in different cases, this isn't to say that it can be, historically at least, defended morally, but it is to say that we can't understand its moral perversity if we can't make distinctions about the kinds of projects that it took up and the way it took those up. And so what Las Casas sees when he goes to Venezuela is not only the failure of his ideas in the positive sense, like the ideas he was constructively building, but also the failure of his acquiescence to the transatlantic slave trade. And so he comes back, he enters the Dominican order, he kind of goes off the map for 10 years, he studies, and he emerges as the Bishop of Chiapas. And Chiapas is in the Yucatan Peninsula. Chiapas
home of our dear comrades, the Zapatistas.
Yes, that's right. Las Casas is the defender of the indigena in that fertile crescent of the Americas, of the Yucatan Peninsula, and that kind of nexus point between Central America and North America. And his appointment as bishop, I think, is a strange one. There's a lot of controversy about how in the world did that happen. There's also he was undermined at every step as a bishop. He wasn't a particularly effective bishop. And that's why after he tries his resettlement start over approach and then becomes a Dominican, tries his ecclesial approach in Chiapas, he eventually goes back to Spain, where he had been writing throughout the 1540s disputes against a series of scholars, most famous among them being Sepúlveda.
And this is bringing us back to this debate.
Yes. And he there faces Juan Inés de Sepúlveda in the 1550 to 1551 in the Valladolid debate. But to me, what's interesting about this is, well, at least two things. One is that he tried other things and they didn't work. Mm-hmm. He tried a kind of Benedict option. Let's just go somewhere else and start over. And that failed.
Personal appeals to the king failed.
He tried petitions of the king. He tried to become the bishop of the most consequential, arguably, diocese related to indigenous peoples. And by all accounts, failed at that too. And all these failures, I think, are important parts of Las Casas' witness, is that he was not winning. And this is the problem of abolitionism and of decolonial and anti-colonial theology, of liberation theology, proto-liberation theology. By the way, the best English translation, but the best book on Las Casas is by none other than the Dominican Gustavo Gutierrez, the great author of a theology of liberation. People think liberation theology is some kind of newfangled post-Vatican II stuff, and that's because of Medellin and Puebla. What they don't know is that perhaps the great author is another Dominican, who makes very Thomistic, very Aristotelian, very prophetic. He relies a lot on the prophets to build his arguments, and he has a wonderful biography, theological biography of Bartolomé de las Casas by Gustavo Gutierrez. If anybody wanted to start reading about Las Casas, I would send them to Gutierrez's book on Bartolomé de las Casas. The point, though, is...
I think before we get into the debate itself, which is kind of the promise that I made to you, that you'd be able to come on and get into the nitty-gritty of this debate.
Yeah. We set it up nicely, though.
I want to ask just one question, which is, what prevented Las Casas from taking the John Brown option? Was it just a matter of materially there was no way to mount a kind of military campaign against the Spanish Empire?
Sure.
What is really preventing him? Because I think a lot of people would immediately assume, like, he did all these reforms. Where are the actual indigenous people themselves in the story? Where is their resistance? Are they burning? I mean, we are seeing people burning churches today. I personally assume that some of the churches being burnt are being burnt by Canadian First Nations who are angry at the church. Was this occurring at the time of Las Casas? What is the kind of, can you kind of relate that briefly, and then feel free to dive into the debate?
Well, this is a fantastic intervention you've made. And it's one that, I'll be honest, that I struggle with as an interpreter of Las Casas. And I also struggle with, and frankly, I've changed my own views because of this question that you're asking now. I'm thinking right now of just the fact that, was it yesterday, that the Haitian president was killed in his own home?
Yes, by his own mercenaries.
Yeah, I know. And so I'm thinking here of Haiti and its history. And
you're going to have to come back later and we'll do a whole episode about the kingdom of this world.
Okay, yeah.
Have you read that in the original Spanish?
No, I haven't. I have not. Yeah, I should. John Brown comparison here, though, is serious. First thing to say is that I would like to suggest, at least, that while Las Casas didn't take an overtly militant option, he did argue for its legitimacy.
Okay.
So Las Casas marshals all of the just war tradition from Augustine all the way to Aquinas to show that where the indigenous people did resist, that they were resisting according to their own moral right of self-defense and resistance. He even sat with Cortés in the ruins of Tenochtitlan and made this very argument to him that you were not on God's side when you laid siege to this city.
So wait, let's take a pause just right there, because this is very important and timely.
Yeah. So
he never, maybe it's like fruitless to mount a suicide mission. There's a lot of debate to what degree John Brown was of sound mind.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there's a lot to get into there. But what do you think that Las Casas would make of, like, the EZLN, for example? Would he think that their struggle is justified?
I think Las Casas would argue that a proportional moral response to injustice by the people who are directly affected by that injustice is never to be dismissed as morally irrational.
Would that include territorial autonomy? Because that's kind of where the rubber hits the road here, is people saying, we actually want to break from this system and regain a sense of autonomy. Do you think that would be legitimate in his view?
I honestly don't know, because at the end of the day, he's really not a revolutionary. He truly is a reformist. And his arguments, while they give moral legitimacy to self-defense and even moral legitimacy to cultural practices, paganism, idolatry, even the practice of ritual sacrifice. He defends all of those things. He doesn't quite make an overt defense for overt revolution. One of the things, though, he says at the end of his life is that should the kingdom of Spain, which, as you said, ascended very fast, the Siglo de Oro, the Golden Age, that should this kingdom fall, its fall will be an act of God in recompense for its moral failures. And in some ways, you could say, well, he was never a revolutionary. He did serve as a kind of prophet of the revolutions of Latin America, which came a few centuries later in the 19th century.
Would that apply to the Catholic Church itself?
Well, that's just the thing. When he says this fully understanding that the nation of Spain, that the Spanish crown, is not a secular, distinct entity from the church. He also says it, though, as a secular Dominican. This is another thing that's so important about the Mendicant orders, is these are the secular orders which saw themselves as worldly in a productive theological sense that allowed them to advocate for radical reform within the sacred structures of the Roman Church, at the very least. I don't know if there's
a sort of inside-outside situation.
Absolutely. We always forget that secula, seculorum, seculum in Augustine's thought. The secular is a religious concept. It is not exceptional to religion. It's a distinctly Catholic and Latin concept because of its etymology.
Well, I mean, I think Ambrose also has this in some of his hymnography. You get this concept of the sacred. Now we're getting off into a weed here, but I guess to just bring this up, and then we'll tackle the debate head on in the time remaining, in the time that remains, which you'll come back on and discuss in the future.
Sure, happy to.
The question is, what would a Gutierrez make of this question? Because if we're going to draw a line from Las Casas to Gutierrez, my understanding is that Gutierrez died before the liberation struggle in Mexico. Really?
No. Gutierrez is alive right now.
He's alive today.
Yes.
Oh man, we're going to edit this out.
That's okay.
I'm sorry, Gustavo. I didn't realize you were alive.
Yeah, it's okay. He's between where you're at, between France, Notre Dame, and the Pontifical College.
Really? Where is he at in France?
I don't know where exactly. I just know he has a tri appointment. Yeah,
he has a tri appointment. I thought. Yeah. I guess it was Cone that died, and I thought that
Gutierrez Cone did die a few years ago. Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, sorry. We're getting back to the topic. Let's head on now. Attack this debate, because I know that you're a debater and that you believe in debate. I'm kind of in the middle position of people that hate debate and the people that love it. I don't believe in. I'm not really I don't ascribe to this like universal reason or public reason per se. And this is one of the reasons why I think that Las Casas failed in his reforms, is because I think ultimately it's a kind of mystical experience that he must have had that drove him to see the evil. You know, like you were talking about with the Virgin appearing. This sort of like I don't think that we can just logic chop our way to sort of an enlightened view of humanity as, brotherhood or whatever.
Yeah, we're going to disagree on this, and it's a productive disagreement to have. It's a productive point of disagreement. One of the things that I probably admire the most, albeit in a probably too convenient way, is precisely this fact that Las Casas and others like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, they do not give up on that pre-rationalist, very scholastic belief in intellectus and in reason and in the public uses and formation of reason. And you're absolutely right, though, that the premise upon which one who believes in debate has to kind of, the hill you have to die on is the hill of reason. And it is opposed to that mystic moral sense.
I think there's I try to take a mediating position, but I mean,
I'll take the hard line, secular, rationalist position here. It's what I admire the most, actually, about Las Casas, because to me, it's the least obvious from our view in 2020, and it's maybe the most forgotten side, is that he precisely didn't take up arms, yet he didn't acquiesce. And what he did instead was he embraced the disputatio, and he embraced not only his language of Spanish, but the ecclesial language of Latin. And like Descartes and many of the early rationalists, Spinoza, he was writing up Church Latin, his apologias and Church Latin, ecclesiastical Latin treatises, yet also defending in the public square in Spanish against the arguments coming from the crown. And to me, this is a entirely what we would call today modern approach. But he was modeling that approach on the approach of Aquinas. He was modeling it on the approach of Augustine. He was modeling it precisely on the letters flying between the fathers and the patristics. He was modeling it on that very Hellenistic, Athenian ideal of rational discourse and of the agora, and of that ultimately, I would say, philosophical political project. And I am a partisan, and I would say maybe with a certain lack of humility, a proud partisan of that school of Athens. And I think that is the tradition that Christians and Jews and Muslims and people who believe in reason around the world, we take this to be the cosmopolitan modernist approach. But I say no, this is as old as 430 AD BC, you know.
And moving, I guess, to move the ball forward on that. So he has this belief that he can really clarify the questions involving the enslavement and genocide and make clear to the Spanish conscience that this is unacceptable. And not only that it's unacceptable from an emotional or a moral appeal, but that it's literally irrational and a kind of the consequence of disordered thinking. So how does he do it? Attack that.
Well, he does it in essentially two ways. He uses three distinct arguments, but the arguments are more themes or topics. His method, though, is two-pronged. The first one, and it's the one that's probably the most original and journalistic, is he does what he did in his earlier letter and what he eventually also wrote as a history, which is that he just gives first-person anecdotal phenomenological accounts of his witnessing the atrocities against indigenous and African people in the Americas. And the reason this is effective in the context of the debate is that he's doing it in Spain. And so he's standing before an audience who he attacks, saying, "You've never been there. You've never seen what I've seen.
You don't really have that ignorant."
I mean, that's very debatable. That's very debatable. One thing we do know is that the diaries of Columbus, the diaries of Cortés, were often deeply doctored, and we read those to this day. They were often made to appear like the diaries of Marco Polo, and they were really meant to gain support and funding for these projects, which were very expensive and very risky and required a lot of resources and commitment, including military commitment.
When we see
So,
Columbus failed repeatedly to found settlements in Hispaniola, it's not like an
oh
easy
yeah,
project by any
no, not
means.
at all. There was a lot of skepticism in Spain about colonialism because it seemed like a really far away place to be in investing.
Yeah.
And the return on investment, of course, was also very arguable because they dropped maybe more than half of the great treasures that they plundered from the Aztecs into the Atlantic Ocean on their way back. I
Yeah.
mean, so Bartolome de las Casas' argument, first and foremost, and I'd say most originally, in this case, he wasn't doing what the scholastics did, is he made use of the difference of of experience. He says,
Mhm.
I have experiences that you don't have. I have seen things that you haven't seen. The only place I believe we can see this used in the same way is in the Gospels.
Mm.
And where the apostles who had first person anecdotal accounts of, I've seen Jesus,
Mhm.
I've talked to Jesus. The doubting apostle Thomas, put
Mm.
your hands in my side. In this sense, Las Casas uses this very apostolic approach that is different than Paul's approach. Paul's entire premise is, I never saw Jesus,
Mhm.
yet I believe for other reasons. So we have this apostolic, phenomenological, historical, journalistic approach of Las Casas, and it's very debatable, and you could poke holes in it because of the questions like you asked, like, is it actually true that no one knew these things? Or I think it is true that people had a bad history account
I mean, I
of
could
what was
believe it
going
either
on.
way. I mean, you're the
Yeah.
expert, so I take what you say. For me, I think it's kind of, something that one might immediately pose is like, I'm talking to some Spanish noblewoman. Has she ever, seen somebody flogged,
Well,
like in the
definitely
New
not
World?
that. Definitely
You
not that. Now there were cases. In fact, going all the way back to his early teens, Las Casas, his first witnessing of an indigenous person from the Americas was not in the Americas. It was someone who was brought to the New World
All of these
by
human
his
zoo
father.
exhibitions.
Yes, exactly.
Mm.
That was actually put down fairly quickly by the crown. It was morally distasteful, and it ended. Of course, what they picked up was just enslavement within the
Yeah.
native places. So it's not like there was a good substitute for that. But that was the first person eyewitness that Las Casas had of an indigenous person, and we might say that his soul, to take your more mystical account, was
Mm.
maybe first confronted by the injustice of colonization in that moment. But by the time we get to the 1550s, this wasn't a common practice within Spain. So most people hadn't witnessed things like floggings or those kinds of
Mhm.
things. His second approach, though, is the scholastic approach, where he not only uses the scholastic method of argumentation, making rational arguments largely built on proportionality defenses. So he would say things like, we've done X for the reasons I just told from first person experience. Imagine if X was done upon our soil by the
This is
British or
cruel
by
and
the
unusual
Portuguese.
punishment.
Well, he says, look how we respond.
Yeah.
We go to war. It's obvious that we have to
Mhm.
defend ourselves. Why are we then saying that when they defend themselves that they're violent and that they're
Mhm.
evil and all these things? And he made these kinds of proportional defenses, a kind of cultural relativism, really. These
Mhm.
kind of proportional defenses, not only for their just wars against colonialism, but also for their ways of life, and for their lack of evangelization, and for their not being Christians and things like that. Whenever he gets into the theological side of this, which was a huge portion of the debate, for most people in the Iberian Peninsula and across most of Christendom at that time, if so and so wasn't a Christian, it you could do anything you wanted to them
Well, if they weren't Catholic, you could
if they weren't
enslave an
Catholic.
Orthodox
Yeah,
Slav.
yes,
You can,
totally. Yes, yes, yes. This was the intuitive argument. Las Casas attacks that not only through scholastic rational argumentation, but through a battery of tradition. And so this is where he brings out really deep cuts from Augustine, from Aquinas, from Paul, from John Chrysostom, from Gregory of Nyssa. And that is where I think he's at his most impressive as a debater, because he's not only appealing to first-person anecdotal experience, he's not only appealing to sort of proportional, rational, comparative arguments, but he really unleashes what we would today call the Catholic intellectual tradition upon Catholics.
Yeah.
And he performs an internal argument against essentially Catholicism on behalf of Catholicism.
And let's pause that right there and focus on this, because I think this is a place where the contemporary quote unquote debate, if you can even call it that, about these quote unquote schools, if you can call them that, is really centered. And if we can just telescope for one moment, what Las Casas is doing, the point of his argument, the tip of it, is what? Is that either what's going on with this colonialism, it's heretical, it's evil, it's unchristian, it's unacceptable, or is he making a different kind of argument that, a good Christian can also participate, but it's, unwise? Or what is really the substance of this argument in terms of the actual the effectual truth, if you will, of it?
The spirit of his argument is a moral argument.
That's unacceptable.
Well, for these reasons, though, it's moral in the sense that he's arguing on behalf of an idea of the good.
Yeah.
So his argument is essentially that if we accept that Christ gave us the church for the good of all peoples and of all Christians, then it does not follow from that we should commit evil and persecute and exasperate and conduct injustice against others for the sake of that same church, which Christ gave us because it is good. It was ultimately a moral argument based in the goodness of the gift of the church from Christ to the people of God. And he uses here, of course, as evidence, Anselm, Augustine, Paul, and that to me is like the core of his argument, that if you accept the goodness of Christ's gift of the church. By the way, he doesn't say because God is good or because Christ is good, because in some sense that would get too far behind.
He's talking about the goodness of the church itself.
Yes, the goodness of the church as a gift of Christ to the church. So that final moment where Christ leaves this earth and leaves behind the Spirit, and then we have Pentecost in the church. He says the goodness of that particular gift means that when we preach the message of Christ in order to offer that same gift to others, we can't act in a way that is out of joint or entirely goes against that fundamental goodness of the gift of the church from Christ. That is the as you put it, that is the tip of the spear of the argument, the theological argument for that reason. He argues in more secular ways about things like proportional harm, self-defense, and these things.
But I mean, he is with the Dominicans in terms of his, episcopate in Chiapas, of denying absolution to slaveholders, for example, or unrepentant.
Oh, yes. And that is justified oftentimes less, I would say, on that argument that he made in Valladolid, and more based on a pastoral decision that whenever the sinner will not materially dispossess themselves of their sins.
And just to put a very fine point on this, if he were to be victorious in his dispute with at Valladolid, what would the result have been historically? Well, or what did he intend the result to be? An ending of the income of the whole system, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Las Casas.
The stakes, if you will. What are the stakes of the debate? What is he really trying to accomplish?
Sure. Well, I mean, what he's trying to accomplish is he's trying to bring an end to, to all forms of enslavement within the Americas on behalf of the
So it's
Spanish
strictly
crown.
abolition of slavery.
It's the abolition of slavery. It's an abolition of slavery that's a bit more ambitious, though, than some of the abolitionist movements in the United States. In that, what's interesting about the United States is you had a lot of people who did not believe in the full humanity and personhood of Africans, who nonetheless believed, because of its harms against people who enslaved them, believed in the abolition of slavery. Las Casas' argument, in terms of its anthropological basis, believed in the full moral equality of all people.
A true brotherhood of man, a true
absolute fraternity. Yes. And he argued from that on behalf of a lot of those more political arguments. Universal equality wasn't probably the core of his theological argument. There, it was much more Christological.
So get into that, or get into whatever element you think most pertinent.
Well, I mean, your point, though, about the aftermath is really important, because I don't want to overstate. Like, this is, to me, the fact that at the end of the day, Las Casas was a tragic figure, like Moses, who couldn't enter God didn't let Moses lead Israel into the promised land. Las Casas was an insufficient defender of the oppressed in the Americas, and even Valladolid, for all of the triumphalist, rationalist tones I've invoked here, it's not clear that that he won. So public sentiment basically was like all debates. People who agreed mostly with the status quo felt that way. People who did, and there were those who agreed with Las Casas, also favored him. I think, religious, for instance, the Dominicans rooted for their own team a little bit and stuff like that. But there was no clear outcome of that, and there was no clear policy changes as a result. The king did make some orders in order to allow the debate to happen. He put some sort of limits on conquista, so he took it seriously as a political event. But the aftermath of after 1551, as we know, Spain only expanded their territory in the New World and moved on into Asia and the Philippines and other places. So,
I mean, it seems a bit, to me personally, I can imagine someone listening to this who has suffered this whole history and thinking that this man failed to really do much in order to stem.
Sure.
But as somebody who is, a family of missionaries, my ancestors, colonized the New World and all these things, I look at Las Casas and I think, none of my ancestors did anything like this.
No. So this is to me that
he certainly moved the ball forward. The question is maybe, well, go ahead with what you're going to say.
No, I think here we have to embrace the full Aristotelian scope of tragedy, from the Poetics. This idea of tragedy is what is complete, possesses magnitude. He was tragic precisely because he failed in a way that was morally exceptional to others during his time. So it's a failure in a temporal sense, but it's a limited moral victory in another sense. This is, to me, the reason why Augustine was victorious, ironically, over the Vandals, who destroyed the Alexandrian Church of North Africa, and it's never recovered to this day, and it probably never will. I had a Franciscan teacher who used to say, Sam, sometimes the blood of martyrs is the blood of martyrs. In other words, there aren't any seeds that sprout in the immediate soil of it. But of course, the poetic tragedy of the blood of martyrs is that doesn't matter, because the seed of the church is sown at that metaphysical level of the immortal soul. And so
It's
what I
sown
do
in
believe,
a fleshly body and it's raised in a spiritual body.
yes. And so we can say, I think, and this is why the church is going to hopefully canonize Las Casas soon. He's a blessed right now, a servant of God within the Roman church. He was a witness to a moral truth and to virtue, but he was by no means a perfect witness to that, both temporally, politically, nor even at the level of moral virtue. It took him a while, and he didn't get everything right. And I think it's good to think of him in this non-triumphalistic sense, because a great deal of his argument was basically against the imperialism of theological triumphalism.
I see.
He was an anti-triumphalist. It was because of the triumph narrative of Christianity and Christendom against Moor and Jew and Muslim in Spain, against Basque, against even the Catholic kingdoms that preceded it, of the many different languages and peoples indigenous to Spain. We have to remember that Spain is an anti-indigenous entity. And anyone who doesn't think this, talk to someone from the Basque region or from Galicia, or someone who feels that the Gallego language is being stolen from them.
Yes.
Not to mention Nahuatl or Mayan or any other language, But it's this anti-triumphalism that Bartolomé de las Casas stood for that also prevents us, I think, from overestimating him. And I think that this is the message of true abolitionism, which is the abolitionist is someone who ultimately seeks the kingdom of God on earth, but who never enjoys that kingdom, and who can never sit back on their laurels of that search for justice and simply stop or seek a partial justice. And this is, to me, why the movement towards abolitionism, whether it's in John Brown or Las Casas or Gustavo Gutierrez, or Martin Luther King Jr., or anybody else who associates or affiliates themselves morally with that moral project of abolitionism, I think it has to be anti-imperial. But of course, empire wins. That's what makes it empire. I mean, we wouldn't have empire if it wasn't the entity that precisely wins. And so long as there are winners, there will be abolitionists who are opposed to those temporal victors. And whenever those temporal victors come from a overtly religious side of power, like the Holy Roman Empire, then it forces, I think, Roman Catholics in this case to choose which church they serve: the Church of Christ, the abolitionist church, or the church of the empire.
The Sixth of Rome.
Yeah. And Las Casas chose Christ. Yeah. And I think we have a long tradition of abolitionists in Catholicism. And I think that abolitionist spirit is why, for instance, so many of, I'm thinking here of Caribbean, the Black imaginary and the music, for instance, of like Bob Marley and others, they look to Exodus as their story, which is the Passover story, which is a story that, of course, Jews every year recall. It's a story of emancipation, a story of liberation, a story of freedom. And it's a story that isn't only memorialized through ritual memorialization, but is also realized through a diaspora of resistance. And this unites, to me, all the oppressed people of the world. Paulo Freire, he's a theologian and philosopher from Brazil. He has this beautiful word in Portuguese called the esfarapado. And the esfarapado is a farapo, so a person with threadbare clothing who fought during the Farapo Wars. against a particular empire in Brazil against the Portuguese, and they never won. They lost every battle they fought, and they're famous only because they lost more battles consecutively than any other militia and revolutionary in all of the anti-imperialist struggles of Latin America. And Paulo Freire dedicates his book, Pedagogia do Oprimido, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, to the esfarrapados do mundo, the farrapos of the world. And so to me, Las Casas was one of those esfarrapados. To me, he was one of those people who never won, and who was probably never going to win, and who nonetheless believed sufficiently in a gospel that is in some sense a gospel for losers, a gospel for the poor, a gospel for the oppressed, a gospel for the margins, a gospel that is set against the powerful. He believed enough in that gospel.
And and this is maybe a very important question that we should address before we end, which is,
yes,
he did not come to that gospel alone. He was not reading the scriptures alone in his home. He came to that gospel through a shared common a tradition, through a shared form of life that he entered into through the Dominican rule, through this shared life with the friars. And I think when people are listening to this, if they are emotionally or otherwise, spiritually, intellectually, whatever, moved to say, we must take some kind of action today, I think that it also has to come through this shared form of life.
Absolutely.
The only way to oppose, whether it's within the Catholic Church, without the Catholic Church, in Canada, the United States, wherever, there has to be, the only way is to come together and find this shared life.
Which is communion.
Which is communion, where you can actually even begin to attempt a reform or a dialogue or debate. I mean, Las Casas, as you said, he could only come and do this whole debate because he had the Dominicans with him.
Yes.
Who actually pushed him, who were more radical than him.
Yes, exactly.
Him.
Yes, and we have to also understand that Las Casas was not only seeking redemption for the other, he was also trying to redeem his own immortal soul.
Yes.
And he was also trying to make restitution for the sins of his father and for the sins of his nation and of his mother, Patria, his mother, Spain. And so, one of the radical things I think about the emergent philosophy and theology of liberation that comes out of Latin America is precisely this idea that those who need liberation the most are never the oppressed. It is always those who oppress who are in most need of God's mercy and forgiveness and reconciliation and redemption. And what the oppressed offer is not an opportunity for sponsorship, but they offer through communion with them and solidarity with them salvation to the damned, salvation and redemption to those. When you
talk to anybody that went up to Standing Rock, you will get stories like this.
Yes, and so the goal here is not a goal of Las Casas, defender and savior of the indigenous.
Yeah.
No,
and it's also not this sort of. Sorry to interrupt, but this is also not the soi-disant religion of wokeness where you need to expiate your whiteness or any of this bullshit. This is not what we're discussing.
No, not at all. I mean, the great awakenings of the Quakers, the first and second and third of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, were, I think, graces perhaps of these earlier movements like we're talking about here, which did bring about a kind of great awakening, which came with it, which abolition came part and parcel of, especially the Second Great Awakening.
Because this is not about, just to be very clear, this is not about, okay, I've got this, blood on my hands, how do I wash it off? We have just destroyed an entire world.
Yes.
We have just committed genocide. How is life supposed to continue? How are we supposed to actually live our lives?
Yes, and that world is not only a world apart from us. We have destroyed our common world.
Yeah, I've destroyed myself.
So the work of rebuilding the world, the work of dilexit mundum, for God so sic Deus delexit mundum, for God so loved the world, in Jerome's Vulgate. The project of delighting in the world, of making the world palatable again, is a theological project, and it's a project that offers the most to the ones who have morally lost the most, which is never the ones who had their lands taken from them, but it's always those who sold their souls in order to take these lands, right? And this might be perhaps the most radical break from a modern day status quo political leftism that really sees the project as a kind of Reconquista 5, 10, 15.0, and the Christian left, which says, no, we're fighting for you, not on your behalf, but on behalf of our souls and the souls of our children and our ancestors. We're here seeking salvation along with you. And those who need God's grace the most are not you, who in your suffering have been in a way redeemed and accepted from this structure of sin, but it's for us, right? And that to me is a part of what makes Las Casas' tragic sense, going all the way, as I said, to Moses and all the way back to Adam and Eve.
I mean, he's working out his salvation in fear and trembling.
Exactly that. And that is a road that we're all on. For most of us, I would say, you and me certainly, despite my mestizo identity, despite whatever identity you have and share, there are very few of us, in fact, in this world who don't have some part in this project. And the few that remain that truly stand on this clear side of Christ, they are the ones who I think we need to look to guide our actions. So in the burning of churches, I hear the tribal and band leaders saying, this is not the way of our people. Okay, I take note of that. I also hear of white activists who are lighting fires, and I'm saying, you dumb idiots, that's not the way either. But I have room to wait for those who may be committed to a kind of direct action, who I'm a big fan of whoever the acrylic vandals are, who are using acrylic red paint. And I think they must have some insight into this, perhaps. But one thing that distinguishes, though, a Quaker from Las Casas, from a Thomist, is that Catholics, at least Roman Catholics, we are not pacifists. We are not opposed or not unable to deal with proportional violence. And this is where my part has changed. I think I was much more of a default into nonviolence and pacifism.
Yes.
Until I entered into communion and dialogue with, in particular, my Black brothers and sisters in the American church, who always made notes saying, if we wanted to, we would be within our rights to take other forms of direct action. And the fact that we haven't is a virtue that we are owed some debt. And that truly, honestly, hearing it over and over, reading about Haiti and about the alternatives, John Brown, for instance, like you brought up,
yes,
it led me to realize that actually one of the, I think, moral harms of pacifism is it can lead us and it can lull us into this idea that there wasn't resistance from the very beginning from the oppressed. And the truth is that there always was. And that resistance, on Las Casas' argument, was always moral resistance and was always rational resistance and was never excessive or hyperbolic.
And this is also bringing us back into this debate, so-called debate that's going on right now, where people want to say, oh, this is just a matter of using wooden crosses that deteriorate over time or some other kind of deceit. Like, this is a question of genocide.
Yes.
And for someone who is in defense of their own territory, in defense of their own people, in defense of people that they know that were lost. I mean, these schools are not long ago, ancient history. Oh, we're digging up, whatever happened in 1492. These things were closed in my lifetime, in your lifetime.
Yeah.
People that were there are people intimately involved in the running of these institutions, which are still alive.
Yes.
And I think the question of pacifism is well taken. I think the question of self-defense, as articulated by many, including El Hajj Malik Shabazz and others, is very interesting.
Sure.
But there's this question of how can we sit here and tell people you should just just forget about it.
Yeah.
I can't. I'm not going to condemn people for whatever, throwing paint on stuff. And obviously, we have these situations that are incredibly dangerous and volatile. But there's this sort of flattening the sort of discourse, and this is where I think people come against you with this whole public reason thing. Just this total flattening of the issue. The discourse just takes everything, big pancake, we're done.
Well, it doesn't have to. And I think that actually those who flatten supposedly through rational argumentation are actually they're usually really bad at the use of reason, and they're unaware of the tradition's wide range of breadth and depth on that.
No, you're right. And you gave us a 2-hour window, so I'm just going to leave the final 5 minutes to formulate a response.
My last response would be maybe the only thing that's been missing from the Valladolid set of arguments, which is the pragmatic argument. And it's the one I don't like to talk about because it's maybe the most effective, and it appeals most to a Christian sense of self-preservation. And for those reasons, it's not the one I like to lead with. As you might have noted, I like to lead with the phenomenological first experience one. And then I like to move into the rational one. And then I like to offer the theological one. But I did leave one out. A lot of Las Casas' argument was that this makes us look really bad. And that's not good for us. So he also made the argument saying, look, history is going to judge us. And the things we do are not going to be forgotten. And we can't be doing this thinking that someday it'll all be forgotten and everything will just, in other words, he made a kind of argument for a kind of pragmatic consideration of historical memory. And he said within that God says that he will deal with those who are outside of his church. What we need to worry about is with ourselves who find ourselves inside of it, to not give scandal to it. And so he made this, I think, very practical argument. He bases it in Valladolid on or actually in his Apologia to end the Paul's letter to the Corinthians. But he basically says it's not our role to act like God before men, and we should fear and tremble those of us who fall into acting like gods. It's a Promethean conceit to believe we can do that. I think that of all the arguments that Las Casas offers, this is the least difficult for the Christian of today to appreciate. And it's maybe the most effective with thinking about the church burnings. It's simply awful as a professed Roman Catholic for me to act more aggrieved by arson and by vandalism than I do of genocide. Forget the rational argument, forget the theological one. It's simply embarrassing to me and to everything that I love as a Christian to act this way. So I need to hold my tongue. I need to sit back. I need to shut up and know my role here, even if I don't agree with it, simply because I don't want to bring further scandal upon my church. And I think when you look at the bishops, I don't believe the Canadian bishops universally are by any means laudable sources right now. But they are holding back from trying to turn this into a we are the victims now kind of a thing. You'll hear that selectively. But we are being led, I think, by people like my Archbishop Miller, who I'm proud to see offering unequivocal apologies,
And
saying
I failed to mention at the beginning that you're actually in British Columbia. You were
British
in
Columbia,
Canada itself.
Vancouver, yeah. And so I am, and he is saying we are going to lead the way in communion with Indigenous people. So we will not chart our own course here. We in some sense we've lost that right. We will only work in dialogue with and leadership from tribal and band leaders locally and across Canada. And I have great hopes that Francis, as his health recovers and as he receives an Indigenous delegation from Canada, with the Jesuits and other people in Canada sending letters that are extra mural from the Council of Bishops, and here we see the secular sacred thing happening again. I'm hopeful that Francis will judge this well and will offer a new apology, and that Canadians will respond to it with this pragmatic, even sense of restoring our cultural memory. But that's a huge part of the argument. It's not, I think, the most convicting one. It's not the most radical one. It's probably the most reformist of all of them. But it's maybe the one I would leave you with, simply to give something to someone who's listening to this as an extreme skeptic of perhaps me, or of perhaps you and your show, or of Las Casas. That that's going to be the hardest one to get out of.
Well, we thank you very much, Sam. We know you're limited in time. You also have a podcast we should probably promote, Folk Phenomenology.
Folk Phenomenology, that's right.
Which is not actually about the role of Gene Ritchie and the formation of German philosophy. What is the premise of the show, briefly?
The premise of the show is an interview with Louis Armstrong, where they asked him what kind of music he played. And he said, I play folk music. And they said, why? He said, because I play music for folks. And so the sense of the folk that I'm invoking through folk phenomenology is the idea that when we enter into communion with common folks and with people, and in particular when there is music to be shared, and every episode has a soundtrack that I make for every episode, custom to it, that there we can engage in that project of first philosophy, which has always been the scope of phenomenology, to understand things themselves as they are, but also to understand the things themselves as they are in their appearance to folks, in their appearance to people, and their appearance to each other, even in the very appearance of a person to another person, as we're appearing to each other here in this interview.
Well, I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to speaking with you in the future and seeing you blow people up in debate.
Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.